Welcome to Silicon Bites. This episode is one of a number I'm going to be recording this week as part of the reaction to what happened a couple of days ago in the Oval Office, and not just the superficialities of the argument, the meltdown that occurred, but also the long-term impact, as well as what may have underpinned it, what strategic reasons there may have been for those attacks on Zelensky. And in this episode, I'm going to look at the abusive nature not just of Vance and Trump and how Zelensky was treated as a guest in the White House that behaves as an abusive partner towards allies and perhaps less abusive towards adversaries. We must also draw the conclusion from this that the US should not be given a veto over Ukrainian security, over European security, over British security. We're going to look at some of the statements of Keir Starmer and others the last couple of days because it's clear that on the surface, they're trying to patch things up. They're trying to remain an ally of the US. But this episode is going to look at some of the behaviors we've seen that suggest that the US is no longer a dependable ally, but has turned into an abusive ally or perhaps an abusive adversary. Let's break this down. Before we do that, thank you to everybody who's contributed to our recent campaigns. Of course, the campaign to do events to have an impact on Ukrainian victory, at least 2 a month is what we're planning. We've already done 2 in January, and we are now planning more in May, certainly, which is going to be Lviv, Kiev, and Odessa. But we're also going to have events in Berlin before then and in London. All of these are aimed not just to sort of talk and just to record videos, but to actually have a real impact on policymaking and guide Europe and Britain towards a more active support for Ukrainian victory. So let's turn to the title of this episode. Is it clickbait? Is this Trump bashing or Trump derangement syndrome, as some refer to it? No, this is a cold analysis of what just happened in the Oval Office and what the implications are for geopolitics and finding a way to end the war against Ukraine. Curiously, over the last week, I've been called a Trump appeaser in numerous comments and in about the same volume accused of loathing Trump and being irrationally opposed to him. This is the problem with the fire hose of falsehood strategy to flood the zone, fill the media with sound and fury. Ultimately, it is obscuring the significance, the meaning of events, and it masks the strategy behind the word salad that we see in social media and on television. And there is a strategy behind it. There most certainly is. Even though there is no clear or consistent plan from day to day on how to execute against that strategy, a strategy there surely is. Well, let's lay my cards down, just to be clear, and these will be discussed in numerous episodes over this week, next week, and subsequently. The strategy is to end the war, but on Putin's terms, because in Trump's mind, might makes right, and he perceives Putin to be the stronger player in this war. That means that Trump does not have a magic formula to end the war. He has not found some miraculous way to align the demands of Putin and the needs of Ukraine, because these are irreconcilable in their current maximalist states. No, he expects Zelensky to capitulate and for Russia to make no meaningful concessions. How do we know that? Well, because all the demands for concessions have been directed towards Ukraine so far, and no equivalent demands have been made to Russia and Putin. Capitulation and the evisceration of Ukraine is the only outcome of a process dictated by Trump. Zelensky understood this, and in the meeting in the Oval Office, he resisted that plan. What is Trump's overall plan? Well, it's less of a plan, more of a conviction that he and his donors should profit from the situation. Whether the war ends or continues, pauses for a while and then resumes, whether Ukraine survives or is obliterated, the aim is to profit out of all of the participants. Traditional alliances, relationships and political cultures and conventions play no role at all in this, and we get fixated on these to our detriment. Trump is bound to nothing except his own needs and the limitations of the way he perceives the world. Relationships based on personal gain, usury, and abuse are what drives Trump's actions. His MO, his operating system that is now projected from the business and TV world that he came up in, the real estate world, is now being projected into the geopolitical world. For those Trump sees as stronger and richer, he displays a kind of nauseating obsequiousness, a desire to please and emulate. For those he considers less powerful and less rich, the relationship can only be based on a demonstration of hierarchy, an imposition of status, and when the so-called partner that he sees as inferior pushes back, as Zelensky did against his lies, against his coercion, and against his attempts to demean and humiliate Zelensky, well, then things don't go so well. Let's be clear, it's an abusive mindset, and Trump only seems able to maintain these extremely hierarchical, abusing relationships in geopolitics. So let's look at some of the specific examples of that abuse. Well, calling for Zelensky to resign, that is a clear one. Let's look at who benefits from that. Well, this is a classic Russian strategy over the last couple of months, and alas, it is now being repeated by many in the Republican Party. That strategy can only benefit Putin, can only cause chaos and division in Ukraine, which weakens its defense against the aggressor. And in actual fact, support for Zelensky was already high, and following the attacks upon his person in the White House, that support has grown. There may be people who say that Zelensky could have done better, myself included, that with a bit of preparation, a little more caution. Not that he should have sucked up to Trump, but he could have perhaps hit back harder and more eloquently with just a little bit more training. But this is not Zelensky's fault. This is not Zelensky blaming him. He is not to blame at all for what happened in this setup in the Oval Office. And calling for him to resign is one of the most deeply undemocratic things the US has ever done. And for those like Lindsey Graham who are calling for it, Zelensky had the perfect riposte. I'll give you Ukrainian citizenship, and then you can vote for what you like. The implication here is that you are not a Ukrainian citizen. You do not have a vote. You do not have a right to legislate who runs Ukraine and who doesn't, who represents the Ukrainian people and who doesn't. What we are seeing is grotesque mafia tactics disguised as democratic criticism. And anyone repeating these, stop and think very carefully about what you're doing. An intriguing post has been circulating on social media that looks at the psychological aspects of Zelensky's catastrophic press conference with Trump and Vance. Catastrophic, I would say, in the PR sense. Strategically, what happened, although hardly planned by Zelensky, may ultimately work in Ukraine's favor. We see that with allies rallying around and almost immediate commitments, quite dramatic commitments, to give material and military assistance to Ukraine. Well, we'll look at that in future episodes. Here we are deconstructing what happened in the Oval Office, and this analysis was formulated using textual analysis conducted by ChatGPT. So please put aside any partisan allegiances and the baggage of left-right political thinking. Look at what the actual words say about the relationships between the participants, as if you were watching a social interaction, not a piece of weaponized political theatre. Here are some of the key points that make it more evident that we were witnessing a remarkable exposure of the abusive mindset that now informs American foreign policy. That's not to say behind the scenes diplomacy does not involve coercion and heated arguments. Normally, I'm guessing that it absolutely does. But here we have something new, putting it all out there in the public as a tool of coercion, a public screaming match, a verbal ambush used to manipulate the public sphere to pressure a supposed ally to agree with a policy that is not in their national interests, and to concur with lies that were created by the very nation that is attacking them. Number one, blaming the victim for their own situation. Trump explicitly tells Zelensky, you have allowed yourself to be in a very bad position. This is classic abuser rhetoric, blaming the victim for their suffering. The implication is that Ukraine itself is responsible for being occupied by Russia and for the deaths of its people. It leans into a classic Russian strategy, and one also used by the Germans in World War II. Provoke, attack, and then blame your victim when they protect themselves. The more they fight back, the more you try to demonize them as the original aggressor. Number two, pressure and coercion into gratitude. Vance demands that Zelensky says thank you. This is an extremely toxic tactic, forcing the victim to express gratitude for the help that they desperately need, only to later accuse them of ingratitude if they attempt to assert their rights. Let's put this in context. Apart from the extreme discourtesy and indecency on the part of Vance, when the reality is that Zelensky has expressed gratitude to the American people no less than 94 times in 3 years. And at the start of this very meeting, he also expressed that gratitude once more. If this were a social setting, then we would view Vance's behaviour as verging on psychopathic, demanding thanks for gifts that he did not personally bestow and which were not paid out of his pocket. The challenge is that those seeking fealty to the king at the court of Mar-a-Lago are doubling down on this piece of rhetoric above all that came out of that meeting, perhaps the most disingenuous part of those proceedings. Number three, manipulating the concept of peace. Trump claims that Zelensky is not ready for peace. However, what he means is Ukraine's capitulation. Zelensky is not ready to capitulate, is not ready to stop fighting for survival. This is a classic manipulation technique, substituting the idea of a just peace with the notion of surrender. We will cover this in a future episode later in the week, but here Trump's strategy is exposed. It is not an equitable peace, durable peace, or peace with justice. What Vance is demanding is the unilateral capitulation of Ukraine to its attacker because of some supposed superiority. Evidence suggests that Russia is now weaker than at any time in the last 3 years, unless, of course, the Trump team decides to prevent its collapse and defeat and lift the economic sanctions against Russia. There are signs that this is exactly what they're considering doing. Number four, refusing to acknowledge the reality of war. Trump repeatedly insists that Zelensky has no cards to play and that without us, you have nothing. This is yet another abusive tactic, undermining the victim's efforts by asserting that they are powerless without the mercy of their savior. Zelensky's genius retort that he had not come to the US to play cards. Now, Trump may believe this highly distorted version of reality. The truth is that Ukraine does need its allies in the US and Europe, but it has scored many victories through the will of its fighters. The weapons, yes, of its allies, but also with the fruits of its own innovation. Pushing the Russians out of the Kiev region, Kherson and Kharkiv, the incredible boldness of the Kursk offensive, taking back the Black Sea from the Russian fleet, and the decimation of the Russian oil refining industry with long-range drone attacks. Number five, devaluing the victims of war. If you get a ceasefire, you must accept it so that bullets stop flying and your people stop dying, Trump says. Yet he ignores the fact that a ceasefire without guarantees is merely an opportunity for Russia to regroup and strike again. And in fact, a unilateral ceasefire on part of Ukraine simply means that Russia will win and decimate them. This is another demand for capitulation to the attacker. In a world where power is the only value, Trump sees Russia as an inevitable victor. But reality does not work in this way. And capitulation to an aggressor, one that has come to erase you, your language, your culture and identity, that does not lead to peace. It leads to something even more terrible than war. Number six, dominance tactics. Trump constantly interrupts Zelensky, cutting him off. No, you've said enough already. and you're not in a position to dictate to us. This is deliberate psychological pressure designed to establish a hierarchy in which Zelensky is the subordinate. We saw this trick played with Starmer too when Trump cut him off during a press conference. There is an element of mutual incomprehension here, of course, not aided by Zelensky's English, but essentially this was a display of aggression on the part of Trump, an angry and defensive old man, a jealous and intemperate person who does not accord respect to those he perceives to be either weaker or poorer than himself. He does not see Zelensky's leadership qualities because these are not values that he himself holds. This was a display of bullying rage, narcissistic excess that Vance was planning to trigger, I believe, with his blatant attack on Zelensky. He wanted something like this to happen. It must have exceeded his wildest dreams. He wanted to torpedo the conversation. 7. Forcing capitulation under the guise of diplomacy. Vance asserts that the path to peace lies through diplomacy. This is a classic strategy where the aggressor is given the opportunity to continue their aggression unchallenged. Note, Zelensky is criticized in a variety of ways and on many occasions. Xi hardly at all, and Putin never by Trump and his acolytes. Zelensky is painted as a dictator, yet the real dictator, Vladimir Putin, is never labeled as such. Number 8, projection and distortion of reality. Trump declares you are playing with the lives of millions of people, yet in reality, it is he who is doing exactly that, shifting the responsibility for it onto Zelensky. He further alleges that Zelensky is risking World War III through the simple act of resisting aggression. It must be pointed out that this is a classic Russian narrative that underpins reflexive control, and especially the nuclear blackmail that was a favoured technique with Biden. Note also that this technique, while still directed at Britain, is not being used against the US under Trump. Why? Well, maybe because Trump is unpredictable, irritable, and reacts in an emotional way. He carries grievances and is sensitive to slights. Maybe that's one reason, but more likely it's because Putin can see he's getting a result with Trump, who is amenable to a more transactional approach. Translating that into basic terms, he has no values and can be manipulated by money and possibly flattery as well. If anyone is playing with World War III, it is Russia, who has been doing this since 2008 and has been upping the stakes steadily from 2014 through to 2022. Number 9, creating the illusion that Ukraine owes the US. Yes, the US is assisting Ukraine, but presenting this aid as you must obey or you will receive nothing is not a partnership. It is financial and military coercion. One could even call it a form of abusive blackmail. This strategy is to deny Ukrainian agency and indeed sovereignty, something that Putin also does. It also ignores any sense that Ukraine are fighting for values and not simply for material benefits. It's also to introduce a vicious, extractive, rapacious, and abusive psychology into the conduct of international relations. Make no mistake, allies of the US will be looking at this and thinking that any one of them could be treated in the same manner as Zelensky. Number 10, undermining Ukraine's resistance. Trump states that if it weren't for our weapons, this war would have ended in 2 weeks. This is an attempt to erase Ukraine's achievements and portray its efforts as entirely dependent on US support. This is not true either. Britain supplied weapons at this crucial early phase and in quantities that made a real difference, and other countries shipped fuel and other resources essential to Ukraine's survival. Ukraine also was helped by the huge cache of Soviet-era weapon that it was able to call upon and weapons that it took from the Russians as well. But without the will to fight on the part of Ukrainians, none of this support would have mattered. Ukraine is grateful to support from allies and has expressed this multiple times to the American people. But supporting a partner is one thing, and using that support to extort and psychologically manipulate is quite another. Vance and Trump are using support as a tool of abuse and blackmail, and for all of those in the GOP who are nursing hurt feelings over this, get over it. Ukraine is fighting for its survival, not playing a game of cards or anything abstract or some kind of domestic political game of point scoring. So, who benefits from all of this? In each case that we've covered in this episode, it is Putin and Russian foreign policy that is the chief beneficiary of this debacle in the White House. And indeed, if you read the Russian press this week, you will see that absolutely clear, writ large, in multiple headlines, not just from the key propagandists as well. Whether Trump and Vance are Russian assets or not is a moot point. And indeed, that is a narrative aimed to keep us bickering amongst ourselves. Don't lose sight of the fact, however, that what has happened in this last 2 weeks benefits Russia and is a net disbenefit to Ukraine. Well, we'll follow up on all this in an episode tomorrow and through the week, because there are many other policy choices being enacted that can also be seen as net benefits to Russia and not beneficial to the American people or America's traditional allies. So here's the conclusion. Trump and his team employed the full spectrum of abusive tactics: gaslighting, victim blaming, coercion into gratitude, and manipulation of the concepts of peace and diplomacy. This was not a negotiation. It was an attempt to force Zelensky into accepting terms beneficial to the US, but potentially fatal for Ukraine. A forced capitulation, not a step towards peace. Trump has forgotten or maybe never understood a simple truth. Not everything in this world can be bought. You can buy oil, real estate, and influence, but you cannot buy conscience, honor, trust, respect, or in this case, buy peace and justice from a brutal dictator. Even the most powerful empires crumble when they reach a certain level of cynicism. We saw that in the Soviet Union when no one believed the lies anymore. When those in power begin to see people as mere resources and wars as business deals, when values are superseded by transactions alone, when surrender is disguised as peace, when victims are forced to express gratitude for crumbs off the table of the greatest superpower in history, support not even provided by this administration, but by the previous one, when reality is replaced with the twisted narratives of the aggressor, then you know who is in the wrong and who is in the right. The victim is not culpable for being attacked, or the aggressor right because they are strong and willing to inflict violence, suffering, and pain, or prepared to brazenly steal. Russia is the aggressor, Ukraine is the victim. We must help the one and not the other. This should be clear to anyone with a conscience.